You're listening to The Alchemist Tomb, Part 7, The Canadian Frontier, Chapter 40, Oxford House, 1853. For 2 centuries, the Hudson Bay Company had privately owned the land known to the local Cree as Manitowoc, or Manitoba. Although Henry Hudson is credited with discovering the massive interior bay that created a passageway into the northern interior of the American continent, the Cree who lived along the shores of Hudson Bay encountered numerous invaders from across the Atlantic Ocean. When the fur trade industry exploded, Hudson Bay quickly became a lucrative, albeit remote, way of avoiding the chaos of the Great Lakes waterway. While for a short while, France and the Le Moyne family tried to capture the outpost in the Hudson Bay territory before turning their attention to the Gulf of Mexico and a southern passage up the Mississippi River. After 1713 and the end of Queen Anne's War, England claimed the entire watershed of Hudson Bay, which became known as Rupert's Land. For the century that followed, the Hudson Bay Company turned the region into a fur factory with posts at Rupert House, Moose Factory, Fort Albany, Fort Severn, York Factory, and Fort Churchill. For Antoine Clement Sr., York Factory on the Hudson River offered the fur trader of French ancestry an opportunity to work sparsely populated rivers and lakes rather than the heavily populated Louisiana territory. Clement Sr. supplied furs to the York Factory, a large white wooden building on a narrow peninsula between two rivers that emptied into Hudson, the Nelson and Hayes. The only reason the York Factory existed so far north was to process furs, and further up the river, smaller posts existed for the same purpose, to trade furs for supplies to survive in the rugged north. The farther up a river a fur trader went, the easier it was to find virgin territory ripe with beaver. Because of its remoteness, Clement Sr. chose to make a home just north of Oxford Lake, which allowed him to bring furs to posts on either the Hayes River or Nelson River. For a large man, which Clement Sr. happened to be, a portage over land made it possible to earn money smaller men could not risk. 30 years after Antoine Clement Jr. left home, he returned to find only maggots feeding upon the corpse of his childhood. What am I doing here? Like his father had done 50 years earlier, Antoine Clement Jr. left his companions on the Nelson River to portage to Oxford Lake. The house where he'd been born had been toppled by 40 years of cruel winters, but his destination had never been his childhood cabin. Setting his canoe down in the Carrot River, he paddled toward the closest town from his youth, Oxford House. I do this part alone, Clement told himself as he steered toward the shore rather than to the docks of Oxford House. He'd heard rumors of what had happened, but seeing it with his own eyes finally made it real. In 1836, Antoine Clement Jr. had arrived at Fort Snelling in the Minnesota Territory to see the final years of the fur trade industry. Stuart sent him ahead of Joseph Nicollet to play the part of a simple but strong Métis, Brunia, a part he was born to play. Back in 1837, traders whispered about changing trends in New York City fashion, and also a vanishing population of beavers. Now, Clement looked at the rotting corpse of the fur trade industry in Canada. As a child, Antoine relished trips to Oxford House, where a season's worth of furs would be traded for precious goods. Shops of all sorts provided whatever traders needed, from dry goods to luxury items. Oxford House never grew into a city where people built streets full of houses, but at its height, it took hundreds of merchants to deal with the influx of commerce. Even though Clement was a large man, he also knew how to be invisible, and with a whiskey bottle filled with water, he stumbled to the edge of town, choosing trees and alleys to assist in spying. Under his jacket, he had pistols and knives in case he needed to make an immediate kill, and he also had his rifles hidden along with his canoe, just in case. After 4 hours of stealth, Clement stepped into public view to wander into the town cemetery. Even though he knew where his Cree mother was buried, he avoided going directly to her grave marker. He looked for the Sinclairs. Bill Sinclair came from the Kingdom of Great Britain, a full generation before his father. And like Antoine Sr., Bill Sinclair married a local Cree woman. For the Cree, giving a daughter was meant to be a lifetime partnership between father and son-in-law, and for most marriages, it became exactly that. Bill Sinclair married Song on the Water, the daughter of a swampy Cree chieftain named Young Man Chief. With his Cree bride, he not only established a trade network with the local hunters, but also sired 15 children with her. Antoine's great childhood was surrounded by young Sinclairs, and he toured the graveyard to see which ones remained his living enemy. There she is. Hello, Mother. Antoine knelt down at the grave of Mary Starlight Clement. He didn't really remember her face very well, but he found pieces of her in the women who he wooed between Hudson Bay and St. Louis. His father had been away when she died, and he and his brother Francois had to go to the neighbors to deal with the corpse in their house. Even after she was buried, their father didn't return to Antoine and Francois, so they spent a year at Oxford House. Both the Clement boys and the Sinclair boys were Métis, but what separated them was the fact that the Clement brothers were viewed as wild heathens, and the Sinclair boys were pampered city kids. It was a violent year living at Oxford House, and when their father did return, the boys refused to return to the town where the bullies lived. Now I have returned with revenge in my heart. Antoine rose and continued down familiar roads until he stood in front of the Sinclair house, built on a hill overlooking the trade post. A light was on. The day was growing long, and he watched the house from a distance, but there was no traffic, no one going in or out. They've all fled to Madeira. Why am I even here? A figure crossed in front of the kitchen window. It could be a servant. Antoine cocked his pistol, then placed it in his weaker left hand so that his right hand could later grip a knife. Knives were quiet, and he only planned on using the pistol if necessary. Magnus, Thomas, and Jameson Sinclair were his greatest tormentors during that awful year following his mother's death, and he could remember their faces quite well. Junior Sinclair had already been a grown man working alongside his father at the trade post, and neither of them gave much thought to helping the motherless Clement boys. Would the blood of Thomas or Jameson atone for my father's death? Antoine wondered as he approached the back steps. Am I looking to take a hostage? Will I have to torture them, or their children? With the hilt of his knife, he pounded on the back door. It opened a moment later, and an old woman stood in the doorway, as puzzled as he was. For the first time in 3 decades, Antoine Clement remembered what his mother looked like. Chapter 41, Oxford House, 1853. The old woman was not his mother. Although she had his mother's eyes, the woman standing in the doorway was easily in her 80s. I thought you were dead, Song on the Water said, her hands on her wide hips. Or are you a ghost that has come back to haunt my family? You remember who I am? Antoine asked. Of course I do, Song on the Water answered. You are the brown giant, Brunia Masabe, and you have returned to fulfill your destiny. I've only come to avenge my father. Huh, the old woman voiced and turned away from the loaded pistol. If you have come for revenge, your father's blood is on my hands. Come, sit, eat, and I will explain. Even though he'd hated the Sinclair boys, Song on the Water had always been an honest woman. Song on the Water walked by the table, pulled out a chair, and then turned to the kitchen. She sheathed his knife, but switched his pistol to his dominant hand. He accepted her invitation to sit at the table, keeping the pistol ready should the old woman produce a weapon from the cupboards. A few moments later, she returned with bread and pork. You have your father's frame, but your mother's face, Song on the Water noted. She was my brother's daughter, which makes us blood relatives. I remember when they brought you to my home after her death." "So do I," Antoine said bitterly. "Where are your sons?" "My sons are grown men who now protect their families." Antoine reacted by taking a deep breath, but he did not argue with the old woman, and instead held his breath and bit his tongue. Song in the Water seemed to have noticed. "I did not know why they asked about you. Whatever happened to those boys we took in?" "I knew your father took the family to St. Louis because he sent letters to me. When I learned about your father's death, I knew what my sons had done. Years ago, my husband showed up on his big ship, and my sons departed on other big ships. I am the only one who remains, for I refuse to be part of their schemes anymore." "Who was it? Who asked about me?" "Magnus. He came to collect the entire family, and in the chaos of stealing my grandchildren, I gave little thought to why he asked about the child of my niece." "It was Magnus?" Antoine repeated and pictured his childhood bully. William and John Sinclair were grown men when Antoine was young, but Magnus, Thomas, and Jameson were of similar age. Several daughters gave the Sinclair family a small army to lord over the traders. Now they were all gone into hiding. I need to understand who leads the family now that your husband is dead." "Junior runs the business, but Magnus leads it. He is one of 3 men from the 3 families that came to our land. Can you forgive me for my part in your father's death?" Antoine ignored the question. What do they want? Why are they willing to kill others to get it? "The men of the dawn? They have been coming to our shores generations before I was given as a bride to one of them. Once, all they sought was a passageway, so we let them pass. But then they came as conquerors, but only to control the land." "What do they seek?" Antoine pressed, thinking of Joseph Nicollet and William Drummond Stewart's tales about the Philosopher's Stone and the history of the quest that went all the way back to the Holy Lands. "Explain it to me." "As a boy, you were baptized with water and spirit into the Christian church, and I also took a Christian name when I was baptized. Shouldn't everyone seek to understand the mysteries of life? My family teaches to keep an open mind and find truth in all things, which is why my people found truth in the stories from the other side of the world. One of the stories involves water. In the Christian Bible, it is the story of Noah. My people explain the story in another way. When the world was young, mankind served the Creator by tending to the creatures he'd placed in it, and for a while there was harmony. Then came Whiskey Jack, the trickster, who brought chaos and turmoil to the world with his lies. He learned the secrets from beaver and muskrat, who were charged with containing the waters of the world with a great dam. Once evil Whiskey Jack learned their secrets, he trapped them and turned to destroy their work. He found a powerful stone and used it to break the dam, bringing a flood that buried the entire world. But the flood waters were so powerful that they trapped Whiskey Jack in his own mischief and freed beaver and muskrat. With the help of Raven, who flew over the flood waters gathering survivors, muskrat gathered trees into a great raft, and beaver dove down to the depths to bring up soil to make a new earth. Antoine remembered the tale from his childhood, but the campfire tale now took on new meaning in light of Nicolet's knowledge. Song in the Water looked down after telling the familiar story of the flood, but she was not done. Whiskey Jack remains buried deep under the earth, but he is not forgotten. The Raven remembers him, and it is said that he still watches over the place where the trickster is buried. The survivors that the Raven gathered into the new earth also remembered Whiskey Jack, and while the descendants of Beaver built a new world, the descendants of Muskrat searched for their old friend, Whiskey Jack. Even though the Creator made Whiskey Jack his most powerful creation, he made sure that the trickster was buried deep under the earth. Yet still, he is the source of water. Now, do you understand the intent of my wicked muskrat children? This is what Stuart feared. Whiskey Jack is another name for the devil, or is the first of Stuart's 7 kings. America, a lost continent with a lost king. And how do you know this? Giving your daughters away in marriage does more than just rid yourself of an extra mouth to feed. It also allows your daughters to learn secrets. My husband was sent here to find a place where the water flows in all directions. They are seeking Whiskey Jack. That is our name for the trickster, not his. Although Magnus and Thomas gathered up all of my children to bring them back safely to the east, Jameson did not return with him. Is Jameson still here? Not long after your father took you and your brothers to St. Louis, my husband sent Jameson away. First back to Scotland, and then on a pilgrimage to the Holy Lands. When he returned home, the family's interest in the fur trade waned, and all of our focus turned to finding the headwaters of the great river known as the Missouri. It took Antoine considerable focus not to laugh out loud or even smirk. Nicolet's ruse worked. After men such as William Morrison, Henry Schoolcraft, and George Fanshawe eliminated the Mississippi River as the legendary river in the Philosopher's Stone lore, the Order of Eos immediately shifted its focus west until chance brought Joseph Nicolet into the story. Having seen the ancient map, Nicolet followed in the footsteps of Eos. Once he drew their gaze, he developed a plan to confuse his enemies, and for his final years, he made plans for a final expedition to the Missouri River. Friends like Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, John C. Fremont, William Drummond Stewart, and Carl Geyer lent their talents to the ruse. Nicolet's great distraction, however, came to a sudden end at the hotel in Baltimore when an assassin poisoned him before he could join the others. Nicolet's friends took their vengeance, but the Order of Eos swallowed the bait even after Nicolet's death. Where did Jameson go? He took well over 100 people with him, well provisioned in order to lay claim to the territory known as Oregon, where he planned to go deep into the Rocky Mountains. The source of many rivers, and a place where the great Creator piled the mountains high upon the back of Whiskey Jack. But that was a decade ago, she explained. Jameson took the colonists in 1841. There are rumors that he returned to the Red River colony for more men, but I have not seen him since he first left. When Antoine left St. Louis, he also traveled up the Missouri River into the wild frontier, where he made a living as a guide and hunter. It was 1,000 miles from his childhood home of Oxford Lake to the Canadian Rockies, and several hundred more to reach the other side of the Rockies and the shores of the Pacific. It could take years to find him. Think, did any news return from Jameson to his brothers and sisters? So I can help you kill my son? Trust me, Song on the Water. By stopping one man, I could save the lives of all your great-grandchildren. Does he really mean to wake Whiskey Jack from his slumber? She asked. When he returned from his trip, he brought something back with him. A strange stone carved before the days of the flood. Did he already find the Philosopher's Stone? Antoine felt his heart leap in his chest. Years earlier, he'd taken Nicolet and Shagobay to the cave at Lake Manitou. If Nicolet hadn't died in 1843, he would have joined Tiope, Faribault, and the son of Sleepy Eye on a quest to return to Lake Manitou. Is it too late? Has our plan been thwarted? Did you see this stone? It was broken, a black slab with strange writing upon it. Magnus claimed they were the words of an ancient prophecy that they would guide Jameson to the right place. I've never seen such a thing. The stone was carved with such perfection and polished to such a fine sheen that it looked like a window opened into the dark night. The stone absorbed light without reflection. Only the broken edges of it made it seem real. Do you know what it was? No, but I'll be sure to speak of it with Professor Morgan. Antoine shook his head. Did any of the colonists return from this trip? Any of them? The old woman shook her head. No, none of the colonists returned, but their guide did. You know him. You gave him his name when you were boys. Crooked Arm. Of course, now he is Chief Crooked Arm. You could speak to him, if you are foolish enough to risk it. Antoine had risked confronting Crooked Arm once, and it almost cost him his life. To find Jameson Sinclair and the mysterious Black Stone, it was a risk he had to take. Chapter 42, Lake Winnipeg, 1853. Professor Corey Morgan waited with the luggage and the boys. Somewhere, a few miles south of their camp along the Red River, Lord Erskine and Antoine were hiring men for a great hunting expedition across the northern prairie. Either that or they're murdering somebody. Morgan knew the purpose of their journey to America, and he also understood why neither man trusted him to partake in the vengeance. Instead of a trunk full of weapons, he hauled a trunk full of books, texts, and notes. I am tasked with solving the mysteries surrounding the Order of Eos. That is all. Vaktar Forsberg endlessly sharpened the knife Clement had given him. Sophus Nielsen sat in a nest of the three trunks, drawing upon a notebook with a pencil that was nearly to its nub. My research assistants, Morgan scoffed. Both boys were armed with revolvers to help defend the luggage. The idea of arming untested boys had bothered him, but both had more combined grit in them than he ever had. How long will it take to get to the mountains? Forsberg asked, putting the blade away. The hulking red-haired boy walked over to the shade of the camp and sat down beside Morgan, who knew what he wanted, more stories. At least they enjoy my tales. Morgan opened his vault, but only for a dash of realism. He found his Arrowsmith map of British North America, with the United States outlined in yellow, Mexico outlined in green, and Canada outlined in pink. It had been 10 years since J. Arrowsmith published the map, and most of the empty spaces had been filled all the way to the Pacific. He placed his finger at the southern end of Lake Winnipeg. We are here. The river we traveled on, the Nelson, connected to Hudson Bay. From the bay to where we camp right now, it was a trip of about 700 miles. He looked up to see if the young brute was listening. But that was by steamship. We're about to make the rest of the journey by horseback. The journey across the prairie will be another 700 miles. But once we reach the mountains, the difficulty increases. Vaktar leaned forward, and Morgan winced a little bit as the boy's rampant body odor offended him. Do you think my Viking ancestors ever traveled this far inland? Forsberg asked. I think it's possible, but very unlikely. My ancestors made the trip, Sophus Nielsen said matter-of-factly, bringing the conversation to a halt. He's either a jokester or a compulsive liar. Nielsen's nose remained in his notebook for a few more moments before he looked up. When he noticed the staring, he asked defensively, What? Sophus Nielsen was older than Forsberg, perhaps by a couple of years, but he still had a smooth baby face and thin arms and chest of a boy. My forefathers traveled all over the world. My grandfather told me stories about it. We're descended from Thor. Thor had red hair, Forsberg challenged. If anything, I'm a descendant of Thor. Nielsen shrugged, his eyes returning to his paper. That's not the way my grandfather tells it. My family went out into the world to look for Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. Is he saying this just to impress me? Morgan wondered. Forsberg did not like Nielsen stealing his thunder. Thor died in the Ragnarok. How could you, of all people, be his descendant? He was a god. Nielsen would not be bullied. In my language, our family name, Nielsen, means cloud champion, who is the Norse god of thunder and lightning. You're not a descendant of Thor. Tell him, Professor Morgan. Oh dear, what have I created? Yes, Thor died in the Ragnarok in the act of killing Jormungandr. And even though the world was destroyed during the battle, there were a few survivors, including the 2 humans who hid in the tree, and 4 lesser Norse gods, 2 sons of Odin, as well as Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor. Are you telling me this scrawny thing is a descendant of Thor? Forsberg asked jealously. With a grin, Morgan shook his head. I'm just saying that the tales allow for the bloodline of the gods to continue into our time. For a minute, the unexpected dispute seemed resolved, until Nielsen opened his mouth to say, except instead of going west, my ancestor went south from here. It was probably the Nielsen River before they changed it to the Nelson. What are you talking about? Morgan asked, now interested. The story you've been telling Vaktar and the others, the one about Jacob Noyen. My forefathers were also on that expedition. The clever boy is just trying to get a rise out of Forsberg. Since they found the stowaway on the Atlantic crossing, he'd grown bolder and bolder with his storytelling. Was he? Who was he? My forefather? He was just a nobody like me. But in his blood, he was another cloud champion, making him a gifted sailor. He just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time when the Sinclair ship stopped for supplies. He was Tau Nielsen, one of the 8 survivors of the expedition who went deep into the heart of the continent. Too specific to be believable. He was part of the Noyen expedition? Why is this the first time I've heard about it? You never asked. Forsberg isn't the only one with old bloodlines. Tau Nielsen, Morgan repeated almost in a laugh. He'd been able to research all about Jacob Noyen, Ivar Bardson, and Paul Knudsen, but he'd never learned much about the crew. So he had no way of corroborating or disproving Nielsen's tale. My grandfather told stories about the 8 men who were abandoned for more than a decade. Oh, did he? Who were they? Well, there was Noyen of Berg, of course. I think there was a priest also named Veit. I don't remember if that's his first or last name. Forsberg's forebear was Mikkels Forsberg, a giant of a man. And then there were the others, Drummond, Dobie, and Morrison. Drummond, Dobie, and Morrison. That's only 7 survivors. Oh, I forgot Bjarni. Bjarni Olafsson. He was with them too. They were all part of the larger expedition of men sent by the king to go rescue the Greenlanders. He's heard this from me. Now he modifies the tale. What about Paul Knudsen, the expedition leader? Did you forget about him? I didn't forget about him, Nielsen said defensively. He just didn't survive. I only know the names of the survivors, the ones who walked all the way back. A lot of them died. Probably got attacked by natives, Vaktar offered, and then turned to Morgan. Are we going to run into natives on our trip into the west? Clement is half Cree, and most of the tribes between here and the Rocky Mountains are Cree, so I wouldn't worry. They didn't get killed by Cree, Nielsen added. They ran into the Greenlanders, and a great battle took place, leaving only 8 survivors. Those were the men who found a way back home 20 years after they left. This tidbit gave Morgan pause. According to the records he'd found, the Royal Court of Norway mentioned Paul Knudsen leaving in 1354. If Knudsen spent several years searching and several years coming home, he would have returned in the 1370s, about the time Prince Henry Sinclair of the Orkney Islands began a revenge tour that led to his conquest of the Faroe Islands in 1391. Your grandfather told you this story? Sophus nodded enthusiastically. My forefather stood right where we are standing. I recognize it from my family tales. You recognize it? How? At this, Forsberg sighed with disdain, stepped away, and walked down to the river's edge. Nielsen shrugged it off and answered, From Greenland. They followed the same route we just took. They followed the coast until they entered Hudson Bay, following the shore until they could go no further west. They left their big ships at the mouth of the Hudson Bay, and the rest went by canoes up the Nelson River, all the way to where we are now, Lake Winnipeg. Am I a fool who wants to believe the story to be true? Hold on, how many men were on the expedition? My forefather was part of the ship's crew, but they didn't want to risk a mutiny, so they left 10 men behind to guard the ship and took sailors. With, so the ship didn't leave without them. There were 30 total. 8 of them were experienced sailors from Gothland, and the others were Northmen from Bergen and Faro. The king and the bishop first hired men from Gothland since they knew where to go. That's why there was a Forsberg on the trip. What would have pushed these men to journey so far inland? Is Nielsen combining Forsberg's stories with the stories of the Newport Tower? And they found their way out here. Sophus nodded and rose, carrying his notepad with him. He'd made a map with a clearly defined Hudson Bay and Nelson River. They left the big ship behind at Hudson Bay, and then, like the Vikings of old, they traveled upstream. From here, at Lake Winnipeg, they continued up a long river that flowed straight south until there was no more river. That's when the battle happened. Battle. Nielsen's eyes grew wide as he nodded. Just like us, they were men with old bloodlines who knew all about the lost continent. But these men were not sent by Sinclair. These men were sent by the church. It wasn't a rescue mission like you told it. It was a mission sent to stop them. They found the missing Greenlanders camped at the place where the water flows in all directions, and they battled them to the last man until only 8 remained to tell the tale. What were the Greenlanders doing at this watershed encampment? Most of them were thralls taken from their home by the Order of Eos, but after so long, how could Knudsen know who to trust? He had orders to kill them to the last man, which he did, to prevent Sinclair from reaching the ancient kingdom. And what was the Order of Eos doing at this watershed, so far from the rest of the world? It's like you said, they were searching for survivors of the Ragnarok. He's making this up as he goes. I just mentioned to him that a moment ago. Searching for survivors from the Ragnarok. Yes, except it wasn't Modi, Magni, Vidar, and Vali they were searching for. It was somebody far worse. They were searching for the king of Muspelheim himself, Surtur, the powerful fire giant. You know, the one who led the armies of evil and personally killed Frey. They were seeking him so that he could be freed from where he was buried alive. Is that what we're chasing after? A buried god? Surtur, Whiskey Jack, Manitou? Instead of going west, Nielsen concluded, tucking away his notebook, we should be going south. Oh, we will, Sophus. Before this trip is over, we're going south. Chapter 43, Cold Garden, 1853. Vaktar Forsberg did as he was told. He quietly stood behind Antoine Clement, so close, in fact, that he could see dandruff on the man's deerskin collar. With each passing mile, Clement transformed from the solemn valet for Lord Erskine to a panther in human clothes. Resting on one shoulder, Vaktar cradled the beautiful rifle at his chest. It was loaded and ready, which is why he kept his hands a distance from the trigger, as instructed. Clement rested on his belly, his piercing eyes level with the top of the ridge, and the sights on the other beautiful rifle. Which one will he pick? Which one will die? Vaktar could only imagine what was happening on the other side of the ridge. 2 days ago, the two set out from their camp at the Elbow River, where the others waded along with several guides they'd hired to assist with the trip across the Canadian prairie. With no permanent settlement or outpost for hundreds of miles, and the Rockies looming in the distance, Clement grabbed Vaktar and headed off for the foothills. Clement is no fool like Professor Morgan, Forsberg decided, pleased to be in the company of the esteemed hunter. When the rifle shot sounded, Vaktar flinched, but in the next heartbeat, he passed the rifle forward, just as instructed. By the time his hands reached for the third rifle beside him, Clement had taken aim and fired a shot. His empty hands waited for Vaktar to pass him the third rifle, and a moment later the third shot rang out. Then Vaktar looked over the ridge. 2 dead mule deer were already on the ground as the herd started through the grass and away from the sound of danger. A third mule deer stumbled from the pack, tried to continue, and then fell to the ground. He got all 3. Vaktar was smiling when Clement turned and gave an approving nod. Collect the rifles. Vaktar's movements sounded like a battalion passing by. In contrast, Clement moved like a shadow. By the time Vaktar had everything collected, Clement was already halfway down the hill, knife in hand. When gutting a mule deer, Clement began, and Vaktar absorbed every lesson. For the next hour, Clement taught Vaktar how to field dress the deer. Back in Dalavan, Vaktar believed he was a tough farm kid. Spending a few hours with Antoine Clement out on the frontier, however, showed him a human at his zenith of predatory skills. This journey should impress my forebears. Later, as the others rose at their approach, he walked proudly in step with his towering mentor. Lord Erskine had hired a cook, 2 drivers, and 4 horseback rangers before leaving Winnipeg. And while they were all experienced men hardened by the Canadian environment, they also revered Antoine Clement. Let Nielsen have the professor. Professor Morgan and Sophus Nielsen sat at the campfire just as they'd done during most of the crossing. Back in Dalavan, Vaktar felt as if Professor Morgan was a heavenly angel sent to pluck him from his dull existence. The tales of the Vikings seemed as remote as the tales of Thor and Loki, but then Professor Morgan showed up from out of nowhere, not only to validate so many of the stories, but also to bring Vaktar under his wing on an old-fashioned adventure. And that all ended when Sophus Nielsen forced himself into the narrative. At first, Vaktar enjoyed his company. Both were of similar age and experience, and the two crossed the Atlantic in harmony. With each passing day, though, the tales grew bolder and the truth more far-fetched. "Ah, the hunter has returned. Did you find game?" Professor Morgan asked. Vaktar nodded. Sophus held up another drawing from his notebook. "We've decided to name this camp Coldgart." Cold Garden. Vaktar translated the old Norse words that connected the 3 of them. A fitting name. The camp was made at a union of 2 rivers that flowed out of the Rockies. Nielsen's drawings showed the arrowhead as well as the area where they had been hunting to the west. "We got 3 mule deer," Vaktar declared, glancing down at the bloodstains. Neither gave much of a reaction, and Vaktar walked past them so he could continue sharing silly stories. A few yards away, Lord Erskine and the cook sat together at another fire. "How's the hunting?" "We shot 3 mule deer. Mr. Clement is butchering them right now." "That's excellent news," Lord Erskine answered with a smile. "That means we should have enough fresh meat to continue into the mountains. As scenic as this location is, I've tired of the sedentary life." Vaktar didn't know how to answer, so he shrugged and continued to his tent. He cleaned himself up with a rag and stripped off his heavy hunting jacket. It's sure been a good adventure. He and Sophus had both hoped to head south from Winnipeg. For Sophus, it was a chance to prove the truth to his ridiculous tale about a 1300s trip to North America. For Vaktar, he wanted a chance to reconnect with his uncle Dagmar. Vaktar had been a child when his uncle left Dalavan. This left the second brother, Vaktar's father, behind to tend the property at Fors. In the dozen years since Dagmar left, the family received only 2 letters. The first told of his safe arrival in America in 1836, and the second indicated his plans to travel up the Mississippi for work in a new territory now called Minnesota. Having seen the expanse of North America, Vaktar now understood how poor his odds were of actually stumbling across his uncle. A single pistol shot filled the air. Its echo reverberated, and Vaktar was armed and ready before the sound stopped, only to be replaced by thunder. The sky remained clear, and peaks of the distant mountains also clearly defined. It wasn't thunder that rumbled. Hooves. Vaktar's heart fluttered when he saw a cloud of dust on the northern river. At first, he thought it might be a stampeding herd of buffalo or even a confused herd of mule deer, but the splashes of color told him something entirely different. Indians. Everyone began to arm themselves, including Sophus. Vaktar searched for Clement. "Wagons!" somebody shouted, and the small caravan began to tighten. They had encountered several bands of Indians as they passed through Canada, but the Assiniboine, Hidatsa, and Arikara came out of curiosity or for commerce, and in much smaller numbers. Now, 50 warriors rode at them in full gallop. 3 days after setting up camp, Vaktar finally understood Clement's skepticism about the defensive position of the camp. Even though the northern river was larger of the 2 camps that surrounded them, the horses barely slowed as they descended the banks and easily crossed the river atop a huge sandbar. Antoine! Everyone but Clement had gathered behind the protection of the wagons. He had taken the mule deer down to the river to process the meat, and he stood tall and alone as 50 warriors advanced towards him. Curiously, Clement knelt down and continued processing the deer. The riders divided, passing by him like a stone in the current. "Calm yourselves, men," Lord Erskine shouted out. "They'll kill all of us if we shoot first. Don't provoke them." He's right. Vaktar watched as the warriors raced around the wagons, encircling the entire camp. None of them had weapons in hands. "Cree," one of the drivers said. "The Rocky Mountain Cree." "Is that good or bad?" Professor Morgan asked. "It depends on who's leading them." Antoine Clement stood back up, knife in hand. He quickly sheathed it and bent over to pick up a hind-quarter leg of mule deer, which he lifted and set on his shoulder. 3 riders crossed the river slowly, but did not veer around Clement. They came right up the bank and stood in front of him. "Oh, shit," a ranger muttered. What is it?" Morgan asked. "It's Crooked Arm," the ranger said, readying his rifle. "That's good," the cook muttered. "Crooked Arm is an ally. He's a Christian now, Methodist, I think. He took the name Abraham." "I saw him kill 3 Blackfeet all by himself," a driver offered. "No, you don't understand. The river in front of us is the Elbow River. It's his river. He claims all of this as his hunting ground," another said in a panic. "But," Vaktar found his voice amongst the river, "we were hunting south of the river." "Quiet," one of the rangers muttered. "This could go sideways in a snap." Strangely, Vaktar didn't feel the same fear the others did as they watched the situation unfold. The fierce warrior slid off his mount, followed by his 2 lieutenants. They stepped forward to face Clement. Shit, the eldest ranger muttered. "We're all going to die." "Calm yourselves," Erskine commanded. "What's going on?" a guide asked the elder ranger in a whisper. "From what I've heard back in Winnipeg, Crooked Arm has only lost 1 fight in his entire life, to a swampy Cree warrior named Brunia Masabe, the Brown Giant. Clement is the man who gave him the name Crooked Arm." Vaktar had every confidence that Clement could still beat Crooked Arm in single combat, but the group was outnumbered 5-1. Their ranks were filled with boys and gentlemen, while Crooked Arm brought warriors. Could Sophus kill 5 of them? Vaktar wondered. Could I even kill 1? Chapter 44, Sinclair Pass, 1854. Nicolette is laughing in his grave, Antoine Clement thought to himself. Ahead of him, Chief Crooked Arm's scouts guided their horses through the narrow passage into the valley. His childhood friend and rival rode beside him. Back at Cold Garden, they'd traded the mules and wagons for the swift horses of the Cree. Behind him in the column, Lewis Carnes and Professor Morgan rode amongst the Cree warriors, and the boys rode in the back. Together, they traveled for 80 miles through the most rugged stretch of the Canadian Rockies, following a path that once only their ancestors knew. The days had been short, and much of the journey had been in the shadow of the mountains, but now sunlight met them at the spine of the Turtle. "You're not going to find them here," Chief Crooked Arm said to Clement about the Sinclairs. "The Shuswap live here." "Are they your enemies?" "No, but their resources are limited. They allowed the white men to camp here during the winter months before they continued to the ocean. And now it is known as Sinclair Pass. It's been claimed and put on the maps. Jameson Sinclair, brother of Magnus St. Clair, led 121 pioneers from Oxford House across the Canadian prairie to race Nicolette to the headwaters of the Missouri River. Back in Washington, D.C., Nicolette found himself marooned without funding and his apprentice reassigned, allowing Sinclair's bold move to happen in 1841. And Nicolette's bluff had worked. John C. Fremont, Nicolette's apprentice, eventually found his way west without Nicolette. William Drummond Stewart also returned, going up the Missouri River. Nicolette's Jesuit ally, Pierre John de Smet, added to the subterfuge by traveling upstream as well. The Order of Eos took the bait, hook, line, and sinker, shifting all its resources to the Canadian Rockies. Had Nicolette lived, he would have swept back into northern Minnesota, collected the Philosopher's Stone, and vanished with the help of the Periphery. Unfortunately, an assassin poisoned Nicolette's drink, and all the grand schemes came crumbling down in the fall of 1843. Yet Jameson Sinclair remained in the contested Oregon Territory. So where is he now? "South," Crooked Arm answered. "He's still searching the mountains, singing his song, and hauling his stone with him wherever he goes." "A stone? It must be the one Song on the Water mentioned. Tell me again about this stone." "He kept it hidden from the other white people in the caravan. Only those in his inner circle knew about it. I knew because he brought me with him wherever he left camp. But he only saw me as an ignorant savage." "Was it unnaturally smooth?" Antoine asked, gesturing with his hands to make a mental image the size of a cannonball. "A white egg?" Crooked Arm recoiled. He widened his arm to make the shape with his hands about 2 feet wide, about 3 feet tall. "It was much larger than that. Only a man your size could carry it, and it was black, not white." "Perhaps I can still serve Nicolette and Stewart by acquiring this strange stone." The sound of trotting hooves grew louder, and from the corner of his eye, Antoine saw Professor Morgan listening intently to their conversation. Morgan nodded as if apologizing, and then cleared his throat to ask, "Was this stone cut by the hand of man?" Crooked Arm hesitated. "Yes and no. It had edges and corners, but it was also rough, as if it had been broken off from a larger piece of stone. The edges, though, were so perfect that I doubted that any tool of man could have cut it." "It might surprise you what ancient man was capable of doing," Professor Morgan insisted. "Describe the color of the stone. You said it was black?" "Blacker than night, for at night the stars dot the heavens, but when I looked at the stone, it was as I was looking into a hole in the world. I could see the dust setting upon its surface, but beyond that, only black. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Morgan said with a crooked grin. "So it's not Nicolette's stone, is it?" "No," Morgan scoffed. "It's neither the sacred water drum nor the white egg of Wishwe. This is something entirely different, I believe." And then he turned back to Crooked Arm. He asked, "Was there writing upon it?" "Yes and no," Crooked Arm answered vaguely. "Tell me about the writing," Morgan pressed. Crooked Arm took a moment to measure his words. The words were not letters, but were strange shapes. Runes, Morgan added. But they were not painted upon the stone or cut into the stone, Crooked Arm added. They were part of the stone, like a fish frozen in the ice. It's all part of the big puzzle, but what is its purpose? What are you thinking? Antoine asked Morgan. Professor Morgan reached under his hat to scratch his head and then tugged at his black beard. I'm thinking all sorts of things. The most obvious answer is that Jameson Sinclair is in possession of an ancient Viking runestone, one that was planted in the earth and then broken off at the base. But that doesn't explain the finer details, does it? At least it's not the Philosopher's Stone, Clement decided. A purpose greater than revenge still awaits us. Morgan offered his theory. Legend says that after Odin learned of the coming doom of Ragnarok, he sacrificed himself upon the great tree to learn the secrets of the universe. When he returned from death, he possessed the secret knowledge of runes, which he gave to mankind. But it begs the question, what runes did Odin discover? Who created this runic language for Odin to learn? Professor Morgan winced as if in pain and shut up for a few minutes as the entire caravan came out of the shadows of the mountain and into the narrow, open valley. Ah, Professor Morgan finally ended his pained pause. If only I'd paid more attention to ancient histories that weren't based on Norse. I once encountered a book on Eastern religions and myths that told of black skulls that held the plans of the universe. Or was that Egyptian tale of Thoth, who wrote the universe into creation? So the Sinclairs have a black rock, Clement bluntly reviewed. Crooked Arm smirked and nodded. The Sinclair expedition camped ahead. I later took them all the way to the Pacific to a place they called Puget Sound. And what was waiting for them on the other side? Nothing but sea. Sinclair tried to explain it to me. He said that his British people were in a race to claim the land, and if there were colonists living there, their claim was strengthened. Professor Morgan continued the explanation. Yeah, the United States brought much of its territory from France and the Louisiana Purchase. But in the far west, Spain and Russia first tried to lay claim in the 1820s. But more recently, following the Mexican-American War, those two nations withdrew their claims. Britain, however, tried to argue that Rupert's land claim extended as far south as the 42nd parallel at the border of the Columbia River because of a treaty with Mexico. All that went to hell, of course, following the Mexican War, and the United States claimed everything to the 49th parallel. Sinclair is stumbling around in the dark, searching for proof for his beliefs. Antoine looked at the Continental Divide, remembering how Nicollet searched for another divide that led the Red River north and the Mississippi River south. This valley was narrow. So this is our plan, Antoine started loudly and halted the column. Lord Erskine and the others gathered around where he'd stopped. Once they were ready, Clement continued. Instead of chasing after my enemy, I'm going to let him come to me. He thinks he killed me back in 1843, so when he learns I'm still alive, it will hurt his pride. Back in Oxford House, rumors have already begun to spread about me. We will grow new rumors here. He turned to his blood brother, Crooked Arm. You said there is a southern passage back to Cold Garden, didn't you? Crooked Arm nodded. This pleased Clement. On your way back to Cold Garden, I want you to tell everyone you meet how a wealthy Scottish lord paid you a large sum of money to lead you to this place, where they are building a new colony. Will I see this large sum of money? If you live, yes, I'll make sure of it. Do not search for Sinclair, but tell the mountain tribes that you saw the brown giant, Antoine Clement, in the party. Tell them I am a poor drunkard who lives in a cabin with a young boy. Antoine nodded to Vaktar, who grinned a toothless grin. Now that I know the northern passage, I will meet you back at Cold Garden when this business is finished." "What about us?" Lord Erskine asked. "You will be part of the lie. Create an outpost right on the mouth of this river. Mr. Stewart will pay our hired men for their efforts. Trade openly with a shoe swap, but tell each of them about me. Warn them, in fact. I will build a cabin south of here, right on the river, leaving Jameson Sinclair no choice but to pass by it once he learns about my name being used in this valley. Just you and Forsberg? He'll catch you unaware one day. We didn't come all this way to let you fail. He will be cautious, and if he sees a dozen men, he'll run, knowing I've come for him. But if he shows up and sees me alone, he'll confront me. I want him to step into the trap. Vaktar will be the eyes in the back of my head, and Nielsen will do the same for your camp. I'll let this bastard come to me. His black heart will lead him right into my trap." Chapter 45, Columbia River, 1854. Located at present-day Astoria, Oregon, the delta of the Columbia River is nearly 3,000 miles due east of Oak Island, Nova Scotia, on the opposite shore of the continent. During the Oregon boundary dispute, the United States claimed that Captain Robert Gray of Massachusetts sailed up the river in 1792 aboard his private ship Columbia Redivivia, and thus negated the 1799 Russian claim and the 1807 British claim. War was averted, and Britain surrendered its rights, even though the Columbia River began far to the north near Sinclair Pass. Several hundred miles downstream and 300 miles south by land, Jameson Sinclair ascended out of the Columbia River Valley with his squad of explorers. He sang ancient words as he walked beside Abraham, his gray mule, who pulled a modified rickshaw that carried their dried food, some water, and the Odin stone. The 5 men with him had long ago proven their worth, and they needed no explanation or justification for his strange behavior. They all fanned out 100 yards ahead, behind, and beside him, rifles at their shoulder. Only Donald McBain remained close enough for a conversation, and his purpose was only to coax the mule along the path. In his hands, Jameson Sinclair held a sketch of the area. For the better part of a millennium, his ancestors had explored along the 44th parallel north, even though it wasn't known by such terms. The ancient maps had told them how to calculate the angle based on stars at certain times during the year, and somewhere along the line, the lost kingdom of the original alchemists waited to be rediscovered. Beginning with France, Europe had been explored centuries ago to no avail, and now, after several hundred years, Sinclair had the honor of finishing the search of North America. Upon finishing a verse from the ancient song, he said, "This is far enough." McBain immediately went about his duties. Soon there would be no more places left to search, and despair entered his heart, because the quest might have all been a lie or misunderstanding. The other men all paused, taking a drink from their canteens, while Sinclair prepared his offerings to the ancient gods. Odin gave his life twice to begin the quest, so Jameson Sinclair did not grumble about the duty his family had given him. As the 5th son, he would not inherit the family business or even be a presider in Eos. He was a foot soldier, a priest. When Odin died the first time, he returned from death with secret knowledge, the runes. Even though the broken Odin stone was only a piece of a much larger prophecy, it was proof the gods once existed. In the Ragnarok. Jameson Sinclair hesitated at the next verse of the ancient song. Sitting in the Rocky Mountains, he understood how mighty the war between the gods and the giants had once been. The world had been broken following the final death of Odin, and in the Oregon Territory, he sat upon one of its greatest wounds, a fissure in the earth where stone buckled up high into the air. The Christian texts told of a great flood 4,000 years earlier. Many other religions, including those of the local tribes in the Rockies, shared similar narratives. Modern scientists have now assessed that the event happened much longer ago. How long have the men of the dawn been searching? Sinclair continued the ritual and song, letting his offerings to the mountain merge with the air. In the Ragnarok, the gods and giants perished in battle, but 4 gods fought against the fire giant Surtur as the world buckled around them. Thanks to Odin, the humans were safely protected, but the 4 surviving gods were buried alive, somewhere on the planet. Ancient magic would be needed to wake the gods, and the most powerful tool had been buried along with the gods. His ancestors believed the ancient kingdom existed along the 44th parallel north, and the magical song written upon the black stone could awaken what had slept for countless years. When the song ended, Jameson Sinclair lifted his eyes to the sky. Nothing had happened. Another failure. The only difference today was that one of his men was walking up towards him. "What's wrong?" Sinclair asked. "I heard shooting in the valley below," his personal guard told him. "I think they're attacking our base camp." Sinclair left cattle, supplies, and 24 men, women, and children below at a primitive log cabin fort they'd built last fall. It was the only shelter north of Walla Walla. "McBain," he said, turning to the youngest member of their party, "stay up here until things are settled. You know where to go if I'm killed." Sinclair and his 4 riflemen hurried back down the valley, back toward the Columbia River. Once they reached a ridge overlooking the complex, he saw 36 natives around the perimeter of the shelter. "Who are they?" he asked. "The Cascades?" His senior bodyguard shook his head. "The Cascades are allied with the Americans in this area. Those natives below are the Klickitats." "Why would they attack our camp?" another man asked quietly. Sinclair suspected the answer. Even before he left Oxford House years earlier, he knew an ancient enemy had returned. Could this attack be the Priory of Ormus wearing the mask of the Klickitats? "How do we handle this?" he asked his senior bodyguard. "If we start firing, we might be able to hit a few of them from this distance, but then they would scatter and harass us for days. They'd either burn us out or starve us out. They think we're down there." "Trey left this morning for Walla Walla," one of his men reminded. "He might have heard the attack also and gone to get help." "Or he was killed prior to the attack," Sinclair countered. "As long as the men in the cabin hold tight, they have the advantage. The Klickitats will run out of ammunition first, but then they'll turn to fire." Jameson knew the log complex had been built with enough firing stations to repel such attack. It would be a siege of attrition and ammunition. Sinclair took measure of the situation and slipped behind a small outcrop. "We have an advantage being up here. They don't know about us, yet they have the place surrounded. Before we scatter them, we'll get to the bottom of this. We just need to wait until nightfall." By the next morning, 4 Klickitats were dead and 1 woke to consciousness, bound and gagged, in the little alcove of the ridge overlooking the siege. Having spent the better of the part of a decade in the Oregon Territory, he and his men had gotten to know the local native tribes, who had been pitted against each other during the border dispute between Britain and the United States. They all knew the wave of manifest destiny had crashed against the shores of the Pacific, yet Sinclair knew this sudden act of violence had another motivation. "Were you hired to attack this outpost?" he asked the bound Klickitat. The prisoner nodded in affirmation. "Were you hired by an American?" He shook his head. "British?" Sinclair pressed. Another head shake. "Spanish?" A third head shake. "It's the Russians." Once, the Priory of Ormus had been primarily English, while the Order of Eos had been French. But over the past few centuries, both societies had spread into several other nationalities. Rumors of Ormus colluding with the Russian Empire now seemed believable. "Something's happening below," one of the men called, taking his attention away from the prisoner. From a hole in the ceiling, 2 riflemen appeared on the roof of the stockade and wiggled into position. After taking position, though, the roof riflemen waited. "The men in the cabin are going to make a run for it. They don't even know we're up here." The Klickitats were also rattled, discovering their dead and missing. Grouping together, their perimeters suddenly became porous. "Just wait, you fools," he wanted to shout down to the men trapped in the cabin. But those inside of the stockade acted in desperation. 2 men with water buckets rushed out of the front door for the river. Either for fire defense or drinking, the need for water necessitated the risk. At first, the dash was quiet, unnoticed, but by the time the buckets were full, gunshots rang out. Bullets struck the ground around them as they ran back. The riflemen on the roof kept the Klickitats from running them down, but a hail of bullets followed them all the way to the door, where one of them fell out of the cabin. They managed to drag him back inside by his heels. A knife was unsheathed, but Sinclair shook off the retribution. "The fool should have stayed put. The Klickitats now assume the men snuck out of the cabin to kill their friends. We'll wait until nightfall and teach them the error of their ways. Until then, we'll interrogate our prisoner." Jameson Sinclair knew the history of the Oregon Territory, but he reviewed it all with Ormus in mind. Nikolai Rezanov claimed to be the first European to be born in the territory, and thus his presence should have given Russia claim to the Oregon Territory, as well as the Alaska Territory. Born along the Columbia River in 1818, Rezanov claimed his grandfather and father already built a permanent home and trading post by the time Captain Gray sailed up the river on behalf of the United States of America. Even though his testimony was thrown away, Rezanov remained as the land changed ownership. By the time Sinclair and his colonists arrived in the 1840s, Nikolai had established a foothold in the area through trade and marriage, and his influence only grew in the past decade with an unexplained influx in wealth, which manifested it now in the form of rifles. My brother Magnus was right about Ormus playing possum. Rezanov has turned the Klickitats into puppets in order to stop me. That night, when the Klickitats descended on the stockade with torches, Sinclair's men descended on the illuminated targets with knives. When morning came, a surprise waited for all 3 groups. Led by Lieutenant Philip Sheridan, a group of soldiers came sweeping in unannounced to rout the Klickitats. In their company, Jameson Sinclair's nephew, Trey Sinclair, guided the soldiers to the besieged outpost. The Klickitat prisoner joined the dead before Jameson Sinclair descended the mountain. The lieutenant and his sergeant turned and galloped in their direction, as if chasing fleeing Klickitats. Sinclair waved at them to make matters clear. The lieutenant trotted up. "Mr. Sinclair?" Why were they looking for me? He tensed, fearing a trap. "Why are you fellows out here?" "We were ranging north on the Columbia, near the border, when we were given a mission to go find Jameson Sinclair. Luckily for you, we were already heading this way." "What's the message?" "If the Russian wants me killed, that message has been received." In the distance, the cavalry continued to hunt down the fleeing Klickitats, which interrupted the conversation. The young soldier explained, "There's a situation up at the headwaters." "The headwaters?" Sinclair said aloud, thinking of where he'd begun his exhaustive search of the territory. "Did I miss something?" "A friend of a friend, it seems, wanted you to know that a man claiming to be Antoine Clement is building a trading post on Lake Columbia." Sinclair felt himself grow flush. "Can you describe this man?" "I was given a description. He's a half-breed, a mountain of a man, a drunkard, with a young boy at his side." "Clement lives?" When the conflict ended, the cavalry met the survivors inside the cabin, who were hauling out their dead and wounded into the open yard. Sinclair remained 100 yards from the dazed survivors. Only Trey Sinclair spotted his uncle, who rushed up the hill to greet him with a broad smile. "I thought they'd killed you," he said in reference to the man who'd been shot in the head during the water run. Perhaps they did. Jameson Sinclair stayed on the mountain slope, summoning Donald McBain, Trey Sinclair, and Lieutenant Sheridan to hear his plan. The faceless body that had opened the door for the runners would be buried with his name. Trey and McBain both understood the reasons why Jameson Sinclair needed to die. The family was in danger, and to keep further harm from coming to it, he needed his enemies to believe he was dead. So the faceless body would be buried with his gravestone. "First, I will deal with this Russian Rezanov myself," he decided. The dead in camp needed their vengeance. In the north, another enemy needed to be dealt with, and if word leaked out that Jameson Sinclair had perished, the half-breed would lower his guard and turn to the bottle. And then I will kill Antoine Clement. Chapter 46. Lake Columbia, 1854. Antoine Clement heard about trouble to the south, but he maintained his careful vigil. He also heard the rumor about the death of Jameson Sinclair, but he ignored it. By the time summer ended, the matter would be over, and he could return to his other promises. Life on Lake Columbia had been his second favorite season in his life. Even though Vaktar Forsberg had no idea what the rumors insinuated, the boy had become like a son to Antoine over the course of the summer. Hunting, fishing, and trapping, the boy sponged it all up. Together, they maintained a precise routine. Forsberg, aware that if an ambush came, it would come during the breakfast hours when he left Clement alone, departed before dawn to inspect traps, hunt, and fish. Playing the part of an aging drunk, Antoine purposely let the boy do all the work while he lazily lingered around the cabin, ate breakfast, and drank coffee on the front porch. Vaktar would disappear for hours, but not just for the obvious reasons. By noon, he'd meet with Sophus Nielsen at the stream that fed Lake Columbia to pass on any information to Lord Erskine and the others. By supper, Vaktar would return to the cabin. Being the bait for a trap left him plenty of time to think about his past. After fixing supper for Vaktar, Antoine wished the boy a good night's sleep and pulled his chair out to the campfire to sit out under the stars and think about Jameson Sinclair. There's no way he's dead. It's a ruse. Of all the Sinclair boys back at Oxford House, Jameson had been the cruelest, meanest, and wildest, while Junior had been the calm elder and Magnus had been the ringleader. Jameson had been the enforcer. The older brothers turned him into a bully and then unleashed him upon the world. There had even been news of a funeral, but Antoine refused to believe it. No, he's out there. Next, Clement thought of his time with William Drummond Stewart. Back in those days, Clement was an actual drunkard as well as a show-off and braggart. But as they say, he could walk the walk and talk the talk. Thrill-seeking adventure brought the two together, and alcohol pushed their relationship over the line. Money nurtured their companionship after that, and Lord Stewart doting on his every need. By the time they met Joseph Nicollet, the relationship had almost run its course, only to be kept alive by a new distraction, a legend. Clement heard the story, but in his mind the quest came down to a simple name, the Alchemist. Different from a scientist or sorcerer, the Alchemist had lived long ago in a forgotten kingdom. Stewart knew about him because of the Alchemist map, a document created thousands of years ago by King Solomon to find the Forgotten Kingdom. The secret to finding the Forgotten Kingdom was the appearance of blue earth, or vitriol, which is the byproduct of a magical rock created long ago, the Alchemist's stone. During their trip together to the Middle East, Stewart shared other stories about the alchemist. At Jerusalem, Clement learned all about another alchemist, a Hebrew king named Solomon, who had an obsession with the ancient alchemists, resulting in his own creation, the alchemist's ring. Stewart had his reasons for this tale, even though Antoine didn't fully understand the connection, except that it explained how his family knew the story. Looking up at the stars, Clement found the North Star and remembered a promise. The promise had been made to a strange shaman who had not ever been part of the tour. He and Stuart had traveled north of Jerusalem to the headwaters of the Jordan River to investigate a foreboding cave. It was after the tour when Clement found a need to privately relieve himself in the thick brush that he found where he found the man sitting under the willow tree beside the little creek. "I found you," the old man said. Now, Antoine couldn't remember if the greeting had been in English, French, Cree, or another language he knew. The salutation cut to his core, and he found himself standing before the man, a servant to a new master. "Who are you?" Clement countered. "The comparison is blasphemous, but I am also a beginning and an end, an alpha and an omega, but only a smaller part of the story. Come, step forward." Strangely, Clement allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. The old man reached up with one hand while clutching the willow with the other. His fingers touched Antoine's sweaty forehead and then inspected the damp tips of his fingers. "It is you, but you've changed. Promise me that you will return." Clement didn't understand. "I'm on vacation. I'll never return to this place, let alone your country." "Look. Remember. Do you recognize this willow? Its roots reach far under the earth to a different river and a different cave. You stood upon the roof of his tomb. If you'd stretched out your hand, you could have held the weapon to destroy him and his foul magic." "Who?" With his thumb, the old man wiped away the sweat from his fingertips and then held his hand out. "You are the lost heir. Your blood, sweat, and tears can destroy him." "Destroy who?" Clement had insisted loudly. "His name is lost to us, for even his living heirs would not utter his name. When you look up to the stars, know that his star is the first of the seven, and from the loin of the beast will come the eighth. Promise me that you will return and claim your birthright." "I promise," Antoine muttered before hurrying back to Lord Stuart. He never told Lord Stuart about the surreal encounter. But years afterwards, the promise to the shaman still haunted him, just like another failed promise to a woman had driven him to alcohol. Now he looked up at the constellation commonly known as the Big Dipper. Stuart told him all about the seven stars, including the one known as Merrick, the loin of the beast. "Is that your name? Is the alchemist's name Merrick?" Clement doubted it. He'd heard other names for the constellation. The Anishinaabe guide Shagabe told of the Fisher Cat battling the sorcerer the Wintermaker. His first love, his beautiful young bride, had called it Tun Win, the Blue Woman. What does it matter? Who cares about the name? Clement had broken his promises. He'd broken his promise about returning to Lake Manitou, just as he'd broken his promise to return to his young bride and his infant daughter. Vaktar Forsberg ended the long night of broken dreams and promises. "Did you ever sleep?" the boy asked after seeing him yawn and stretch outside the doorway of the cabin. "I am haunted by bad memories." The boy shrugged and began preparing himself for his day in the dim light of dawn. "I need coffee," Clement decided, and rose from his chair. He loudly began rummaging around, searching for a burlap sack that held the coffee beans. "I'll be off then, hopefully with some of those trout I saw gathering in the pool." Clement nodded. Yes, a trout and then a nap during the heat of the day. By the time he found the bag, Forsberg was 100 yards away, rifle in one hand and fishing pole on the other. With the bag in hand, Antoine went to the cabin to fetch the coffee grinder. The boy had enough sense to leave him alone when he was in a foul mood, but Antoine still felt badly that the boy hadn't even waited for breakfast. I'll make it up to him with supper. When Antoine stepped back in the doorway, a knife greeted him in the belly. He dropped both the grinder and bag of beans in order to grab the hilt before it left his body. He held it there, pinned against his rib, just below his beating heart. He looked up. The face holding the knife was hidden, for in the distance, the light of dawn created a shadow on the man's face. "You're looking quite well for a dead man," the shadow said. Jameson, Antoine thought as he held the knife steady. Eos had arrived. Chapter 47, Lake Columbia, 1854. Vaktar Forsberg stopped when he realized he'd forgotten his fishing knife. He touched his right thigh to confirm its absence. He was already past the peak and descending the other side of the ridge where the little trout pool waited. Damn it. Turning back meant the fish would likely see his approach and make them wary, but without the knife, any fish he caught would spoil in the afternoon heat, forcing an early return also. Damn it. Uncle Dagmar had given him the blade when he was just a child, and for several years he had to observe the blade under supervision before it finally became his property. The 3 inches of steel were nothing special, but the hilt had been carved into the shape of a trout with an open mouth. The darker wood of the scabbard had the 5 fins of a trout, and when sheathed together, it had been a toy as much as a tool. At the top of the ridge, he could see the little trout pool on one side and their little cabin on the other. And horses. He froze while he took in the scene. 6 horses were tied together behind a little cut in the base of the ridge, hidden from the river floor but exposed from his angle. One man stood beside a strange-looking cart. Where are the other men? 2 figures came spilling out on the ground in front of the cabin. Vaktar descended in leaps and bounds like a mountain goat when he recognized Antoine as one of the men, but he skidded to a halt when he saw the back of a man also watching the scene. Another lingered at the river's edge, watching the fight. They came by night. Vaktar put the fishing pole against a tree and slipped out of his shirt, setting it on a branch. With his rifle in hand, he quietly moved a dozen yards from where he'd left his shirt and laid on his belly. Cold stone and pine needles brought focus to his mind. As Antoine rolled on the ground with his attacker, Vaktar put his crosshairs squarely in the center of the closest man's back. He squeezed the trigger and brought death and thunder to the valley. Please be awake, Sophus, please. As the shot echoed, he heard the grunt and stumble from his target, but he remained hidden behind the stone as he quickly reloaded. The first shot had not even finished echoing across the valley when a second shot rang out, a bullet whizzing through the air to a nearby tree. They killed my shirt, Vaktar realized, swallowing hard before rolling out to expose himself. The cloud of smoke gave him a target, but he rushed the shot and his bullet struck granite a foot to the left of the shooter. Vaktar dropped the rifle and charged. He didn't glance once at the nearby shooter, but kept his focus on the first man. He knew he had a handful of seconds to reach the body. At the last second, he did glance up, only to see the nearby shooter finish reloading and lifting the rifle to his shoulder. Vaktar dove on his belly with such force that he reminded himself of a boar hog. He'd knocked the wind out of his lungs and tried to ignore the horrifying drowning sensation as he crawled over the pooled blood to where his first kill had dropped his own rifle. Touching the foreign rifle, he found his second wind, drawing it back into his lungs in a long, pained groan. The dead man's thigh erupted in a splash of blood as the nearby shooter on his right flank rushed his shot. Knowing he had a moment, Vaktar put the muzzle next to the hair of the dead man's head. At 100 yards, the shot was challenging, but the morning air was calm. Without knowing the rifle's sights, he aimed low, hoping a miss might ricochet into the man. The shot struck the man in the center of his hips and dropped him to the ground with a cry of pain. 2 of the 3 men were advancing, one from the river and one from his flank. Blood on his chest, Vakdar left the foreign rifle to sprint as fast as he could to the Alamo. Antoine Clement had explained the significance of the rock depression that overlooked the cabin. He'd used it as a metaphor to explain how a handful of Texans had rallied inside of a stone fort to hold off thousands of Santa Anna's men for days while they waited for Sam Houston's nearby cavalry to arrive. Behind the safety of their stone walls, the men in the Alamo defeated Santa Anna and won the war simply by keeping their heads low and taking careful aim. Santa Anna was trapped between a rock and a hard place when Sam Houston's cavalry came rushing in on the third day of the siege, putting the entire Mexican army to the sword. A shot fired, and a bullet whizzed over his head, prompting Vakdar to zig and zag. 10 yards from the Alamo, Vakdar heard a second shot ring out, and he stumbled violently, somersaulting forward with such force that he almost knocked himself out when his chin struck the stone front of the sanctuary. He had enough sense to ignore the spots in his eyes and crawl forward the last few feet. He rolled over the natural wall and dropped onto his side, out of sight of the riflemen. He ripped off the tarp, opened the rifle case, and pulled out the Manton muzzleloader. Which one do I choose next? The gap in the rock decided for him. He placed the muzzle between the two boulders, and in the narrow window, he saw the left flanker take a spot behind a tree. The river shooter had reached the cabin and hugged a wall while he searched the mountain for a shot. But the man with the horses hadn't taken a hiding spot. Yep, and only cowered. He'll do. It was the farthest shot, but he had the trusty Manton, Clement's favorite. As he took careful aim, controlling his breath, Vakdar felt his heart pounding and pain seeping into his concentration. He grit his teeth and prepared the shot. He squeezed the trigger. He didn't even wait to see if he made the shot. He set aside the Manton and picked up the Sharp's rifle from the case, but in doing so, he looked back to see a toe sitting in a pool of blood. Damn it! He ignored the pain. Swift as a prairie dog. Swift as a prairie dog, he rose for just a fraction of a second before ducking back down out of sight. 2 bullets struck the rocks surrounding the Alamo. In that glance, he saw all he needed. His bullet had hit the man and frightened the horses to such an extent that 2 broke their reins to follow the startled horse with the wagon on a gallop toward the open ground between the cabin and the river. The glance also told him the river watchman had taken aim beside the cabin, while the left flanker began a charge up the hill. Vakdar, knowing it could be his last, let out a breath. He rolled to a center firing position, again putting the muzzle between 2 large boulders. He stared down another barrel, but the river watchman had a blind shot. Vakdar fired. He heard footsteps and blindly thrust his hand into the rifle box a third time. The man roared from behind him, and Vakdar's fingers flinched as it touched the hilt of a pistol. A shot fired, and the bullet bit Vakdar's left forearm, and his fingers that still held the Sharp's rifle went numb. But his right fingers found a tight grip on the pistol. Vakdar spun the revolver and fired at the center of the shadow hovering over him. The man's weight descended, crushing him, and Vakdar felt the butt of the rifle strike him twice. But the second and third bullet discharged directly into the man's torso took the fight right out of him. Even with 3 shots, the man didn't die immediately, but as the life leaked out of him, he also stopped trying to kill Vakdar, who managed to wiggle out from under the dying man. Vakdar lifted his left arm to see a forearm bone come through the bullet hole and his left hand dangling limply. Having chased down plenty of wounded elk, Vakdar remained calm and reminded himself that death would not come immediately. He pulled out his belt and tightened it on his bicep. His missing toe no longer concerned him. For a moment, he aimed the pistol at the left flanker's head, but thought better of it. I need these bullets. Vakdar stood up and looked around for a moment. In the distance, the horses continued running. He didn't see any standing, so he rolled his body over the walls of the Alamo. He hopped mostly on one leg, keeping his balance with his good foot. A bullet had gone right through the toe of his boot, taking the 2 middle toes with it. He tried not to think of his mangled left arm. At the bottom of the hill, beside the back wall of the cabin, he found the river watchman still alive. He lifted the pistol to the man's face, but then lowered it and squeezed off a shot that struck him in the heart. Around the corner, the first thing he saw was a human ear lying on the ground. Blood trails crisscrossed the spot where Clement had been staring up at the stars just a short time ago. In front of the porch steps, Vaktar spotted his fishing knife, unsheathed and covered in blood. The porch railing no longer existed, and the 2 posts that remained were smeared with blood. The 2 bodies had crashed into it were only a few feet away, motionless. Antoine Clement had a bloody forehead and a stream of blood running into his left eye and across the side of his nose. From his mouth, more blood covered his chin, his neck, and his chest, where he held a bloodied human head to his chest. At the center of his chest, a splintered shaft of railing post was shoved up under his ribs. Wait, that's not Clement's body. Stunned, Vaktar blinked again. Clement's powerful left arm wrapped around his attacker's neck, held in a vice by his right hand. For a moment, it looked as if the shard had been part of Clement's body, but it was the attacker, lying in front of Clement, who had the post shoved into his chest. Clement released his left hand, and the attacker rolled off him and onto the deck. Clement was covered in blood with multiple wounds. The most grievous produced bloody air bubbles. Clement lifted his hand and, despite the blood in his mouth, muttered, "Behind you." Vaktar turned to see the far right flanker, rifle raised 50 yards from the cabin. Vaktar had hit him squarely, but like himself, the man pushed his body through the pain to face his foe. A shot rang out. It wasn't a miss, but it also wasn't the flanker's gun that discharged. The flanker fell face forward, revealing the blonde hair of Sophus Nielsen standing with his own hunting rifle at the edge of the trees. Sam Houston has arrived, Vaktar thought, and slid up against the stairs of the porch. Chapter 48, Indian Head Mountain, 1854. Professor Corey Morgan threw his blanket aside in frustration. What is that racket? His fingers found the rifle beside his sleeping mat, and when he sat up, he couldn't locate the source of the noise. He'd camped alone, hoping to make the 2-day hike in one day. The previous night, he'd reached the bluff sandwiched between the 3 peaks, but the optical illusion of a human head changed with his new vantage point. Now he saw 3 distant choices, and thus the cave spoken of by the local Shuswap tribe seemed impossible to determine. Perhaps I should name them after the Norns, Morgan thought. In Norse mythology, the Norns were 3 maidens who not only tended to the great tree, but also controlled the fates. The crashing stopped. Morgan stood up, spying a spot in the valley leading to the Columbia River. What in the world is that? An exhausted horse was ascending the valley, and strapped to both sides, a 2-pole gurney dragged behind it. Poor thing, you're heading in the wrong direction. Hello, Morgan called out softly. Hey. The horse took notice, trotted a few more paces, and then stopped. Leaving behind his small camp, Morgan walked toward the frightened beast, making soft noises to avoid startling it. When he finally drew close, he saw blood splattered on the horse's flank, and his heart sank. He immediately tried to free the pole cart from the side of the horse, but without a knife, its leather bands were difficult to deal with. He walked back to the cargo area, which was made of burlap sacks, leather straps, and buckles, which his fingers quickly undid. Inside, he found the corner of a black stone. Frantically, he pulled away more until he saw strange runes within the stone itself. Sweet Jesus, what is this? A gunshot echoed, causing him to flinch. So too did the horse, and in a moment it bolted ahead, taking the black stone with it. Morgan began in pursuit, but when he heard the second gunshot, he stopped. Standing at the base of the bluff, Sophus Nielsen lowered the rifle he had fired in the air. "Professor Morgan, we need you. Vaktar and Antoine are wounded badly. They're dying, Professor Morgan." Professor Morgan looked back at the galloping horse up the slope. "I know where we're at. It won't go much farther. I'll see what's the matter and come back for it later." This is the end of part 7.